I'm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee Workshop. Today we're going to take some more of our ancient recycled pine timbers and build an old pine bar. Now we found the original in a private collection, and I suspect it's one of those Irish pieces that often end up here in America. We'll show you the antique, and then we'll come back here and build one right here in the new Yankee Workshop. A friend of mine collects old pine furniture, and here's a piece he wanted me to see. He got it at a place that specializes in Irish pine. Not sure what it was used for originally, maybe some kind of storage unit. It has kind of a crude latch here at the top. There's plenty of storage room on the inside. A nice heavy door that has a flat panel and applied moldings. What I like about this piece is the size. It's not too big. It's kind of narrow, and it's just the right height for what he's going to use it for, which is a bar unit. So I think I'll measure it up, get some recycled pine, and build one. Well, what do you think of our version of the old pine bar? I think it'll be a very useful piece. And I think we'll be able to obtain the same patina as the antique because I built it from recycled pine. I found a piece for the top with plenty of wormholes to give it character, and actually it adds value. And check out this door. This small hole looks like it's drilled there, but I think it was bored out by a carpenter bee, because looking on the other side, they excavated the wood, and this was actually filled with mud. Now the pine boards that I used started out looking like this. I trimmed away the bad material on the edges, removed all the nails, and then ran them through my surface planer. The result are boards like these. Now these are not single width boards. The old ones were quite cupped, so I ripped them down the middle, rejointed the edges, and glued them together with biscuits and glue. Now you've seen me do that before, so I'm not going to take the time to show you that today. This is a panel for the top, plenty of wormholes. Here's one of the side panels that's also joined, but you can hardly see it. Here's another side panel. And here's a piece for the bottom shelf. Not a very good match, but because it's inside the cabinet, you won't see it. If you'd like to build a version of our old pine bar, a measure drawing is available with the materials list, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. Now, the first thing I want to do is size the panels for the carcass. The first step is to joint one edge of each panel so that it's nice and straight. The best tool to do that is the joiner. But before we use any power tools, let's take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. That's the process for making the panels the correct width. Joint one edge, then rip it to width a little bit wider than the final dimension, and make a final pass over the joiner. The next step is to square up an end and cut it to length. Now the idea is to flip the panel around, measure from the squared end, and in this case that's going to be 47 inches for the top. Mark it for length, put it back in the panel cutter, and trim it. The back of the bar unit is made up of some half-inch thick tongue and groove boards, and they sit in a rabbet along the side panel. To make the rabbet, I've set up my stacked dado head cutter at the table saw with a sacrificial fence on my metal rip fence. It's set to make a 5/8 by 3/8 rabbet. What you're looking at here is the underside of the top, and I've just milled a stop dado to receive the side panel. I use my router with this guide fence and a 3/4 inch straight cutting bit. Here you're looking at one of the side panels, and I've just milled a stop dado for the fixed bottom shelf. Because I've exceeded the limits of my router fence, I've had to establish this clamp as a guide. Here I've clamped a jig to one of the side panels. That allows me to drill a series of holes which will receive these clips to support the adjustable shelves. The jig clamps to the side panel, and my router has a collar that fits into the jig's holes. A 1/4 inch bit does all the work. This operation is to round over the edges of the top along the ends and the front. I'm using a 3/8 inch radius router bit and a feather board to hold the panel tight to the table. Here I have the pieces of my face frame cut to length and dry fitted together. It's from this frame that will hang the doors. Along the edge of the two outer stiles, I want to make a bead, just like on the antique original. I'm going to mill that bead at my router table where I've set up a 3/8 inch diameter beading bit. I've also established a feather board to hold the stock tight against the fence. But more importantly, this top feather board, which holds the stock tight to the table. Otherwise, I might ruin the bead. Here I've set up my production pocket cutter to make some pockets to assemble the face frame. The tool is really made up of two parts. There's a router with a 3/8 straight cutting bit that makes the pocket, and there's a drill bit that places a pilot hole right in the center of the pocket. Now here's a sample I put together. A little bit of glue and a couple screws in each pocket makes an incredibly strong joint, and you don't need any clamps to assemble it. I once assembled an entire kitchen's worth of face frames using this technique, and it works great. The face frame sits between the side panels. On the antique original, I believe it was nailed in, but I'm going to join the pieces together with biscuits. So that means I have to cut slots in the edge of the frame and on the face of the panel. Here's some 1/2 inch thick boards that I milled out of the old timber with all the edges nice and straight, and I'm going to use these for the back of our bar. But where they meet, I want to have a tongue and groove joint like this. First thing to do is to make the groove. I've set up my table saw with just the saw blade, and I've installed this feather board. What I'm going to do is run one face against the rib fence, then turn the board around, run the other face against the rib fence, giving me a groove that's perfectly centered. To form the tongues on the other edge of each board, I've now installed my stacked dado head cutter, just using the two outer blades. Finally, we're ready for some assembly. The first thing I want to do is add this cleat to the underside of the top. I'm going to hold it 5/8 of an inch in from the back edge, and I'll use this to attach the backboards. One of the sides is next. A little bit of glue in that dado. Drop the piece in, hold it flush to the back, and then take a small square. Make sure it's square to the top, and then I'll toenail some 1¼ inch brads through the side and the dado. As we just did with the top, we're going to install a bottom shelf, the fixed shelf, using the same methods. The face frame is next. A little bit of glue in each biscuit slot and a number 20 biscuit. In addition to the glue in the biscuit slots, I'm just going to run a thin line up the entire length where it meets the face frame. Okay, now we'll set it together and secure it with some clamps. The other side of the carcass gets attached to the face frame, the top and bottom shelf with the same methods. And the other side should fit just as well as the other one. Here's how I begin to attach the back. I rip the groove off of one board. I set it in place into the rabbet, holding about 1/8 of an inch away from the side to allow for expansion, and I attach the boards with 1 1/4 inch brads. No glue. Let's take another look at our prototype. The base is a one-piece base. It has a large bead milled in the top edge, just like the bead that I put in the stiles. We'll make that at the router table. The best way to make the miter cuts for the base is at the table saw with the blade tipped to 45 degrees and use my miter gauge as a guide. Now what I do is set the two pieces together, making sure the joint fits properly. Hold the front piece so it doesn't move as I come down to the other end. Use the other short piece as a guide, rest it right up against the side, and put a little mark right on the top of the base for the length. Now I want to transfer this mark to the bottom of the base, and now I can make the miter cut. I like to reinforce these miter joints with biscuits, and that's what these marks are for. To make the biscuit slot, I need this auxiliary fence on my biscuit joiner, and the miter just fits right into the corner. Now I've laid out the decorative cutout on the front piece of base. This was copied from the antique original, and I'll make the cut at the bandsaw. I'll clean up the rough edges left by the saw with my oscillating spindle sander. A little glue for the biscuit and a little bit more on the entire miter joint, and we'll attach the base to the case with some 1 1/4 inch brads. Okay. Let me show you what we have. It's a rail and style door with a flat panel that sits in a groove, and then there's an applied molding that's sort of a decorative touch. Now, I could have put these doors together with the pocket screws that we used on the face frame, but then the slots would show, so that's really not the best way to make a door. The best joint for a door is a mortise and tenon joint. So I'm going to form tenons on the rails, mortises in the stiles. This is a haunch tenon, and the haunch is necessary to fill the groove when it's assembled. You'll also notice that the groove is set towards the inside of the door, and that's to give me enough room for that decorative molding. Over here, I have the rails and stiles cut to size, and the first thing I want to do is make that groove. So I've set up my table saw with the dado head cutter at 1/4 inch and installed a feather board to keep the pieces tight against the fence. Now I want to be sure, since the groove is offset and it wants to be to the inside of the door, that the back side of the door is towards the fence. Now to make the mortises in the stiles, I'm using my hollow chisel mortiser. It's set up with a 1/4 inch chisel. Now I'm drilling to a depth of a little over 1.5 inches. Next, I'm ready to form the tenons. And if you look, the first cut to make is this shoulder cut. It's not perfectly centered. This cut is 7/16, this cut is 3/16. The fence will stay in the same position, but I'll have to raise the blade for the deeper cut. All right, now I just got to raise the blade up a bit and cut the other side. The next setup is to make this part of the haunch cut. So I've moved the fence a little bit closer and I've dropped the blade to 3/8 of an inch. To complete the haunch cut, I've set up a temporary fence here at my bandsaw, and I'll run the piece in until I meet the previous cut. Finally, the cheek cuts to complete each tenon. I'm going to use my tenoning jig, which holds the piece securely as I run it through the saw. Just as with the shoulder cuts, because the tenon is offset, I'm going to have 2 setups. Here's how I adjust my tenoning jig for the other cut. Loosen up one of the knobs and use the fine-tune adjustment to bring it over to just the right spot. All right, let's check the fit with this sample piece. That's good. Now I'll run the rest of them. Here are the panels for our doors. Now they started out as antique boards that I surface planed down to a uniform thickness of 3/8 of an inch. Then I sized them correctly. Now because they're 3/8 of an inch thick and the groove in our rails and stiles of the door is only 1/4 of an inch, I'm going to need to form a rabbet on the inside. That will allow the panel to be thin enough to fit into the groove around the edges, still gives me plenty of thickness in the center, and gives me enough room for the decorative molding. The setup is my stacked dado head cutter in the table saw, a sacrificial fence. The cutter is beyond the fence by 3/8 of an inch and 1/8 of an inch depth, and a feather board to hold the pieces tight to the table. Now for a little assembly of our door. Some glue on the tenon and in the mortise. I'll slip it all together. No glue on the panels. I want to make sure that these panels have the freedom to expand and contract with changes of humidity. That way they won't force the door apart. Well, the door is sitting in the clamps for a while. Let's continue with some of the moldings, starting with this piece right here under the top of our bar unit. It's a cove molding. To make that, I'm going to use my 1/2 inch cove cutting bit and a feather board to keep the stock tight against the table. I'm going to run each edge of this wider piece and then rip the molding out of that. Now this little piece of cove dresses up the piece, and it's like the molding that was on the original. The last type of molding to make is the molding that'll go around the panels on the door. So I've switched router bits. Now I'm using an OG bit. And I'm going to start forming the molding by running the two edges of this piece. There are a couple of saw operations to make this molding. For the first, I've moved the fence to the other side of the blade, and I've tipped the saw to 25 degrees. Here's the bevel cut that I just made. That wants to be on the saw table. I'll run the piece through to square it up. With the doors out of the clamps and the joint sanded smooth, I'm running a bead right down the edge of each stile. I'm using the same bit that I used to put the bead in the face frame. I've spent the last few minutes positioning the doors in the opening, making sure that the clearance is the same all the way around. I've laid out for the hinges, and I'll be using this hinge right here. It's made by the same company that makes the plate joiner. And if you look at a biscuit behind it, you can see that the radius of the biscuit and that of the hinge are the same. That means I can use the plate joiner for the mortising. I'll position it on a layout line, and when I plunge the blade into the work, it'll mortise the face frame and the door. Boy, does this system save time. Imagine trying to do that with a chisel. For the last few minutes, I've been fitting the moldings around each panel. They just snap into place, no glue, and I'll attach them with some 5/8" brads. I made a couple wooden butterflies to hold the doors closed, just held in place with one screw. Now the last bit of woodworking is to drill a hole for the screw for our wooden knobs. Then it's off to the finishing room. For the finish on our bar unit, we're using our favorite stain and polyurethane combination. And what that does is it really brings out the richness of this antique pine. I'll put 2 coats on the entire piece, but up here on the top, where I'm going to have the most wear and tear, I think I'll apply an additional 3 coats of spar varnish, a nice gloss finish. And that should be able to take just about anything. Well, here it is with several coats of gloss polyurethane on the top. Go ahead, put a frosty glass on it. I dare you. And down below, that stained polyurethane really brings out the beauty and age of our antique pine.